Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution area of Study 1. In this video, we will be continuing to explore the period of dual authority from March to October 1917. We've already done part 1, which is March to May of 1917. This video will outline part 2 and all the events and excitement that occurred from June to October 1917. So let's get straight into it. Firstly, the June Offensive. So on the 14th of May, 1917, newly appointed, I should say, Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, announced that an offensive was required to restore the morale of the Russian military. So Kerensky is really leaning into his position as Minister of War, since he was in fact opposed to the war when the Provisional Government was proclaimed in early March. On the 22nd of May, General Brusilov was made commander-in-chief, and he facilitated the June Offensive, attacking the same location as his very own Brusilov Offensive of 1916. The offensive made good advances, but 40,000 men were lost, and the offensive eventually stalled. The Germans launched a counter-offensive, which led to the Russian army retreating in panic, soldiers deserting their posts, and thousands of officers murdered by their men. Historian Orlando Fage claims that 400,000 Russian soldiers fled the front, and the German army advanced 230 kilometers, marking another military disaster for the Russian army and a failure for the Provisional Government. So this was a terrible blunder by the Provisional Government, because the sentiment in Russia was that they wanted to exit the war. That's why the Bolsheviks were becoming so popular, is that Lenin called for peace-bred land, and so they wanted to find a way out of the war, not to launch an offensive that led to hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing and tens of thousands losing their lives. So a terrible mistake by the Provisional Government. The June Offensive and the failure of the June Offensive led to the July Days. So as a result of the failed June Offensive, worker strikes increased, with workers and soldiers increasingly using the phrase comrade instead of citizen as their go-to greeting to one another. So that aligns with comrade is a phrase used by communists, and so that shows their support for the Soviet and for the Bolsheviks. Out of those 400,000 deserting soldiers, they came home and radicalized. And according to Lenin, they voted with their feet, i.e. they took up arms and decided to not wait for the Constituent Assembly elections, but instead to act against the Provisional Government. So they voted with their feet upon their return to villages. Remember that many of the soldiers were peasants before the war. And so they returned to their villages, now radicalized after fleeing the front. On the 2nd of July, a meeting was held by soldiers of the Petrograd garrison. Trotsky spoke at the meeting, and the soldiers agreed to stage an armed demonstration on the 3rd to 4th of July. So while the Bolsheviks didn't directly tell, or it's at least interpreted as the Bolsheviks didn't directly tell the Petrograd garrison to protest, the fact that Trotsky spoke at this meeting says that the Bolsheviks supported this protest. I like to think of it as, you know, after the 2020, was it 2020? After the election in which Joe Biden won, Donald Trump spoke to his supporters and encouraged them to march on the Capitol, and that led to the riot of the Capitol. This is sort of similar, with Trotsky speaking to the Petrograd garrison and not directly telling them to stage an armed protest, but not telling them not to, if you know what I mean. So on the 3rd of July, that was slightly convoluted, apologies. So on the 3rd of July, Protesting soldiers mixed with striking workers and created an angry mass of armed protesters. Shots were exchanged with right-wing groups and about 400 people were killed. By the 4th of July, hundreds of thousands were protesting. The Kronstadt sailors, who were according to Trotsky, they were the reddest of the red. They were really supportive of the Bolsheviks and of the Soviet. So 2,500 Kronstadt sailors came and supported the movement. Lenin gave a speech to the sailors expressing confidence in the eventual triumph of the Soviets, but he didn't want to take action yet. However, SR leader and Minister of Agriculture Viktor Chernov was chosen to address the crowd to try and calm down the revolutionary action that was taking place. An enraged worker is quoted as saying to Chernov, "Take power, you son of a bitch, when it's given to you." Chernov was seized by the crowd, and it got quite dicey for a second there, and then the Soviet leadership sent well-known revolutionaries to save Chernov, most notably Trotsky, who went out into the crowd. He was shaking hands with the protesters. Not a good look when you're trying to prove that you weren't directly involved in the protests. And yet he did successfully retrieve Chernov. So many ministers blamed the Bolsheviks for the July days. And why wouldn't you? Trotsky had spoken to the Petrograd garrison. Trotsky had shaken hands with the protesters. Lenin had spoken to the Kronstadt sailors, saying that he predicted that they would take over soon enough. And so many ministers did blame the Bolsheviks. One minister leaked to the press unsubstantiated reports that the Bolsheviks were being funded by Germany. This led many right-wing newspapers to accuse Lenin of being a German spy. So on the 6th of July, Alexander Kerensky returned from the front in his role as Minister of War with units of loyal soldiers. He ordered the seizure of Bolshevik headquarters and issued warrants for the arrest of Bolshevik leaders. Lenin went into hiding, then escaped to Finland. Trotsky, along with over 800 other Bolsheviks, were arrested. Party supporters were attacked and beaten in the streets, and worker activists were thrown out of factories by angry colleagues. Here are a few quotes about the July days. Historian Orlando Fage says the events of 4th of July were characterized by almost total confusion. The Bolshevik leaders made up everything as they went along. Historian Neil Faulkner said it was a vast display of Bolshevik power. So there's two different interpretations. Fage says that it was entirely confusing and there was no planning behind it. Faulkner says it was a display of Bolshevik strength and power. Lenin later described the July days as, quote, something considerably more than a demonstration and less than a revolution. So here is another historical interpretation. Firstly, here is a famous photo of the July days and the chaos with bodies on the ground, people running in all directions. Here is the Petrograd garrison during the July days. And here is a historical interpretation by historian James White. He says the elements of continuity between the July and the October days, by October days he's referring to the October Revolution, provide an insight into the significance of both events for the way in which the Bolsheviks came to power. For them, the experience of July, though traumatic, was highly instructive. Now, he calls it traumatic because Lenin had to flee. Trotsky and 800 others were arrested. This was the lowest of the low for the Bolsheviks. They had won favor through the April crisis and due to Lenin's April theses, and now they were being, it was being announced that they were being funded by the Germans, that Lenin was a German spy, and people were not very happy. So the July days, it showed them what a seizure of power would involve, what kind of opposition could be expected, and what kind of problems they would have to deal with. It showed in particular that in order to take power, they would have to be assured of at least the neutrality of the Petrograd garrison, and that some way would have to be found of ensuring that troops loyal to the government would not stream into the city and overwhelm the revolutionaries as they had done in July. Now, the July days leads to the Kornilov Affair. So General Kornilov is quoted as saying, "It's time to hang the German supporters and spies with Lenin at their head and to disperse the Soviet." That quote in itself tells us how conservative Kornilov was and how opposed to the Bolsheviks he was. So on the 8th of July, 1917, just a couple of days after the July days, Prime Minister Lvov resigned and named Kerensky as his successor. Lvov said, "The only way to save the country now is to close down the Soviet and shoot the people. I cannot do that, but Kerensky can." General Kornilov, who hated the Soviet and the Bolsheviks, as is suggested by his quote, was appointed commander-in-chief on the 18th of July. Kornilov, much out of line since he was speaking to the newly appointed prime minister, gave Kerensky some demands, including one, the restoration of the death penalty, something that had been outlawed with the early decrees of the Provisional Government. Two, a ban on soldiers' committees and political meetings at the front. They had made trade unions legal and with the initial decrees, and so this was going back on that. And three, a ban on strikes with organizers to face the death penalty. Kerensky did not want any part of this. He was slightly concerned about his newly appointed commander-in-chief and was not convinced. From the 12th to the 15th of August 1917, Kerensky organized a meeting of politically interested groups and public figures for the Moscow State Conference. He hoped to rally support for the second coalition government, but the socialists denounced conservatives for putting their self-interest before the needs of the revolution. Cadets and military leaders accused socialists of undermining the war effort and ruining the nation. And the whole conference was hostile, with lots of jeering and heckling between the groups. According to Trotsky, the conference, quote, "created nothing and decided nothing." General Kornilov came on the second day and delivered a speech on the need for order and discipline. They needed a strong man, Kornilov felt. Conservatives hoped that Kornilov would save Russia and threw their support behind him. So here is a new commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, who is appearing to make a push for leadership. On the 19th of August, 1917, Kornilov ordered Cossack cavalry units to be closer to Petrograd. Now, he claimed that this was to defend against Germany and also to take out the Soviet, but tension grew between Kerensky and Kornilov as Kerensky felt that Kornilov was ordering the Cossack cavalry units to facilitate a coup against him. So on the 27th of August, Kerensky notified Kornilov that he was fired, which Kornilov rejected. He instead ordered his Cossack troops to prepare to advance on Petrograd to, quote, "save Russia." In desperation, Kerensky dissolved the coalition government and formed a personal dictatorship. And seeking to stop Kornilov's perceived rebellion, he appealed to the Soviet for help. The Soviet leadership agreed to help on the condition that the government released all imprisoned Bolsheviks, all of those 800 plus with Trotsky as well. On the 28th of August, the Soviet established a committee for struggle against counter-revolution and armed workers' militias known as Red Guards. Kornilov's troops never actually reached Petrograd, and the Kornilov Affair came to an end without any armed conflict. But Kornilov and his closest officers were arrested and charged with counter-revolutionary conspiracy. So why is this significant? Firstly, it weakened the government even more. That it created a split between those who supported Kornilov and those who supported Kerensky. It increased crime rates and class divisions within Russia. It definitely damaged Kerensky's reputation. It led to a dramatic growth in Bolshevik popularity among workers and soldiers. So after the dramatic decline in Bolshevik popularity after the July days, the Kornilov Affair led to dramatic growth in their popularity. Bolshevik supporters were now armed due to the establishment of the Red Guards. So this was a blunder by Kerensky. He had worried so much about Kornilov that he armed the Bolsheviks who had previously been imprisoned. And so in discussing, a great quote to indicate this is, in discussing the outcome of the Kornilov Affair, Trotsky said, "The army that rose against Kornilov was the army to be of the October Revolution. They were now armed and ready to take control." The rise of the Bolsheviks. So Vladimir Lenin is, quote, one of his catchphrases is "all power to the Soviets." The Bolsheviks were the only party that was consistently opposed to the government and the war, which increased their support, particularly as the war went on. By late August, many provincial Soviets were controlled by Bolshevik majorities, so they were gaining more influence among the Soviets. Kerensky organized the Democratic State Conference in mid-September to try and form a new coalition government after the individual personal dictatorship was unneeded following the Kornilov Affair. And Mensheviks and SRs pushed for an all-socialist government. But according to historian James White, the conference decided nothing whatsoever. Following the failure of the Mensheviks and SRs' attempts to form a socialist government, Lenin called on the Bolsheviks to prepare for a seizure of power. So this is all happening in late September. Trotsky became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet on the 25th of September. And Kerensky organized a pre-parliament before elections for a constituent assembly. So the constituent assembly elections were due to be held in November, and so Kerensky organized a pre-parliament to arrange that. This opened on the 7th of October, but Trotsky denounced the government, shouting, "All power to the Soviets, all land to the people, long live an immediate, just, democratic peace." So this, I mean, he's mentioning peace and land, not bread, but hey, that will hopefully come with the land and the peace. So Trotsky is throwing his support, is making it very clear that he does not support the provisional government. And so he, after saying this, led the Bolsheviks in a walkout. And Lenin, who had been exiled, returned to Petrograd on the same day. So all of this leads us to setting up for the October Revolution. But let's just briefly talk about the instability of the provisional government. So the provisional government, what we refer to as dual authority with the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government, the PG was actually a series of different governments. Russia, in fact, experienced 5 governments in 8 months, showing the instability of political authority in 1917. Kerensky was one of the only continuous features of these governments. So the first provisional government was announced on the 2nd of March with the abdication of the Tsar. The first coalition government was the 5th of May. The second coalition government was from the 25th of July to the 27th of August. The Directory was 1st to the 27th of September, and the third coalition government, 25th to the 26th of October, 25th of September to 26th of October. A significant crisis led to the collapse of each successive government, with the last crisis being the October Revolution, which saw a Bolshevik Soviet government come to power. So let's briefly talk about Alexander Kerensky. He was born in Simbirsk in 1881, which is where Lenin was also from. He joined the Socialist Revolutionaries in 1905. He was imprisoned and exiled in 1906, and on his release became a lawyer for people charged with political crimes. It's interesting to note that he was imprisoned and exiled after Stolypin came to power, when Stolypin was really trying to stamp out revolution in 1906. He was elected to the Duma in 1912. He rose to prominence as a member of the Petrograd Soviet and as Minister for Justice in the first provisional government. He became Minister of War during the first coalition and ordered the June offensive. He became Prime Minister following the July days, but his political credibility was damaged after the Kornilov Affair. He continued to lead the provisional government, but was forced from power in October 1917. He fled Petrograd in October 1917 and died in 1970, aged 89. And just as a fun fact, he and his Australian wife moved to Brisbane in 1945, then moved to the USA, where he taught history at Stanford University. And that's why we sometimes see Kerensky as a historical interpretation, such as when he calls the provisional government, or saying the provisional government had authority without power, and the Petrograd Soviet had power without authority. So that brings us to the end of this video. Our next video will be on the October Revolution. I hope you have found this one interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.